Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Nela Milic. I'm a TrAIN associate and one of the initiators of Post-Socialism and Art project in collaboration with TrAIN's PhD student, Ewelina Warner, who just gave us an indication to start this event. So welcome everybody. TrAIN is a research center at UIL run by Professor Paul Goodwin. And TrAIN kindly agreed that we start a project this year titled Post-Socialism and Art. It's a platform created for a community of artists and art historians bound by geopolitical experiences and or interest in former Eastern Bloc at University of the Arts, London. Our TrAIN Research Centre has received grants by the British Society of Aesthetics and Association for Arts History for this project, which aims to develop further relations between Eastern and Western experiences of colonialism. At first, we consolidated disparate research perspectives among the staff and doctoral students at UAL in the hope of developing partnerships with other universities, art and organizations, academics as well from different fields. Since 1990s, a number of debates have been taking place in the Western academia. This year has been marked by the 75th anniversary of the experience of the non-aligned movement. So we have a development in the field, but the art and cultural reality of the former Eastern Bloc is still under-conceptualized. As previous guest speaker in this project, Madina Kostanova, has expressed in her work in 2017. And we are hoping that today's speaker will contribute to the improvement of this condition, and we are delighted that he has accepted our invitation. Ewelina, did I miss anything? Do you want to give us the event rules for today?
That was great. Thank you, Nela. Yes, we would like to welcome Boris Buden, who will talk for around an hour, and then we will have around 20 minutes for questions and answer, and maybe then 10 minutes break and 20 minutes for further discussion. And we aim to end around 12 o'clock. So over to you, Boris.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I have to say a few words about myself. I come originally from former Yugoslavia, or more precisely from Croatia, but I have been in the so-called West, which is Austria and Germany. I'm now speaking from Berlin for more than 30 years. From before the 1990, I left already, and I'm trained as a philosopher. I studied philosophy in Zagreb and cultural theory at Humboldt University in Berlin. And I have been dealing, which means writing and teaching and discussing with the concept of post. Now, you know, I've just, I must now emphasize something that I like very much, that you call it post-socialism and art instead of post-communism. This is, I think, a very important improvement in the reflection upon this particular condition, which cultural, economic, political, and historical. Why? Because, you know, at the beginning of the 90s, post-communism was the concept which was used, and it was coined already before the so-called communism collapsed, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. If you want to know concretely who actually coined the concept of post-communism, which is very interesting. It was not someone from the East, but Zbigniew Brzezinski, which is an American advisor to American presidents and one of the main strategists of the of uh, of the Cold War. And at the very beginning, he coined the concept shortly before the collapse, before the fall of Berlin Wall, which is 89, some in spring. And at that time, he believed that the Eastern communist system will survive. I'm just emphasizing it again. Only a few months before of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and for him, post-communism was uh, the uh, uh, a condition in which communist political elites of Eastern Europe have taken some sort of cynical distance toward their communist ideology and starting, to be more pragmatic, more realistic, including private initiative, adapting their system to capitalism. And he believed, and I'm repeating it, only a few months before the Berlin Wall collapsed, he believed that this is the way how the communist elites and communist system will survive, have found its future at that time. Why I'm emphasizing this? Because nobody expected nobody expected the collapse of communist system or socialist system, as you in a more adequate way would say, in Eastern Europe. This was, as some political scientists later described it, this was sort of Black Friday of the political science. You can imagine how many political scientists in the West were dealing with the Eastern European socialism, communism, Eastern bloc, analysts, pundits, scholars, etc., and they were not able to foresee, to simply see that the system is going to collapse within a days. This is very interesting because I'm just reminding you that we are now dealing with something that might be called and should be called historical contingency. What is historical contingency? Simply, we don't know. We don't know how things will develop. And a knowledge, and in our today knowledge societies, there is so much expectation, or if I would, I might probably say so much, too much, of course, utopian energy projected into knowledge. And then we see this knowledge was helpless. It could not know such a huge historical transformation immediately approaching. So it happened all of a sudden that the system collapsed. And you have this picture, Berlin Wall, etc. When my topic today would be, and you saw the title, it's Out of the Identitarian Cage. I would say that in terms of identity, in terms of of the notion of the East, the Cold War divide has survived the collapse of the communist system, and this is what I will be talking about. I was motivated very much by what Ewelina told me about the lack of knowledge on Eastern European culture, art, history, and not only about culture and art history. On the bookshelves at your university, and I saw these empty bookshelves, and what first came to my mind is, okay, what shall I what shall I suggest in terms of a very concrete book. And since I have been involved in writing and collaborating on many book projects, of course I had uh, different ideas. The first idea what came to my mind was a project initiated by MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York, a few years ago, and this is a book. I also contributed with an essay, and I was there working together in MoMA on this project. And this is just to show you. I will give you and send the the. So you see, uh, this is I think 18. This is the title. Uh, this is a book about the condition of the East. But you see, art and theory of post-89 Central and Eastern Europe. You have precisely defined some sort of area, I call it area, Central and Eastern Europe, and you have this idea that you can cover this area with a certain theory, with a knowledge. And I also collaborated in this project. You can find that there are very good texts. Of course, my text is also there, but there is a certain problem with this sort of the production of knowledge on certain area. This is what MoMA has been doing actually as a general project. Let's put it very openly. MoMA is writing the art history of the world. How? So it divides the world into areas and constructs teams for different areas. Teams are composed of what Gayatri Spivak would call native informants. The natives from each area supposed to have knowledge, a particular local knowledge on histories, on art, culture, etc., etc. So they provide this knowledge, but MoMA then does the framing of it in terms of of um, of giving a general concept and collecting it, concentrating it at one place. So this is called Art and Theory of Post-89 Central and Eastern Europe, a critical ontology. Mostly written by the people coming from Central and Eastern Europe. But as I'm saying, it is MoMA that does the framing and conceptualizes it. It's MoMA that writes the art history of Central and Eastern Europe, of the East. So, although I have my text in the book, and this is very interesting for you to read, this is not the book I'm going to suggest for you. And another book which I did not collaborate it, but I know the people who worked on the book, and I was discussing the book. This book is called East Art Map, and you you saw. I think you have this picture. Yeah. Can you? Yes. Yes. Everything is okay, but I have the sound. Can you switch off the? Yes, now it is good. Yes, you see, this is the book. It is a construction of the history of contemporary art in Eastern Europe from 45 to 2000. Clearly, an art history writing. However, it is the East writing the art history of the East. This is why I'm suggesting this book. And it is not about me saying there are plenty of interesting texts and this is the answer to the question and you will find art history. But it is what I'm now suggesting is sort of critical dealing with writing of art history, and I will actually be very critical also about this book. What you see here, this picture of like sort of heaven with stars in the night. What you interesting if you would precisely look at these names of individuals and projects, and you see the lines connecting them. Of course, this is an imagination, but what is interesting, this is exclusively Eastern Europe. There is nothing of the West inside this picture, which means there are only few lines that go outside of the picture, probably to the West. Which what I actually want to say is what you see is an act of the exclusion of the West. It is an art history of the East written through or by excluding the West, as though there has never been any contact to the West, and the vice versa, from the west to the East. However, this is a provocation. This is an attack on the hegemonic concept of history. To put it very short, this is a counter canon. Counter canon. If the world Western history of art is a canon, this is definitely a counter canon. But with all problems of canonization, and if you analyze how this history was written, this is simply that the Irvin, which is a Slovenian art collective, Irvin, NSK, Laibach, the Neue Slowenische Kunst. This is so-called retro avant-garde of the 80s from Slovenia. And, well, they chose 24 critics, curators, writers from Eastern Europe, who then made the choice to nationally from each country one um, curator, intellectual, artist, who then suggested artists to be included into this story. So into this art history. But the choice of the particular artworks, artists and events, as well as their presentation, was always left exclusively to individual selectors. So you have actually very classical um, form of writing history, which is arbitrarily chosen curators, and the logic is national. And what you see is sort of if we would translate it, it's an essentialism in a terms of critical theory, the logic, essentialist logic of writing history. So this is like similar to the Venice Biennial, where you have national curators who then choose who will be representing each nation. So it is not very original, but as I said, it is a counter canon, and as such, it is an expression of a struggle. And we call this struggle for recognition. As you know, an excluded identity struggles to be recognized by, in this concrete case, creating its own counter canon. But again, we are still within the general framework of national representations. We are in the framework of curators, general curator that arbitrarily chooses other curators, and in fact we are deeply into this essentialist logic of identitarian presentation. So you can put this book on your on your empty shelves, but don't expect to simply uh, have an instant knowledge in the book. There is no other way than to critically read all these documents. MoMA's project has had the overall title is Primary Documents, which means that in writing the history of the world art history, they claim to be in the possession or to generate something of primary documents. So primary documents will be found at MoMA, not at in, for instance, in this concrete case, Eastern Europe. But I'm just like introducing this suggestion, very concrete about the book, but my main point is uh, the critical reading is necessary, and understanding that every writing of art history, every try to produce knowledge on certain area is never ideologically innocent, and it shall be always critically reflected upon. So what they did in this book project, they essentialized the difference between East and West and fill the empty space of the East art with, as I said, counter canon. And this is visualized in this East art map. In doing so, they even use almost the same method, which is national curating. But we shouldn't judge Irving's um, project, artistic work, only through the result, only through this book, only through this picture of East art, of the East art. Um in fact, uh, there is something much more important, which is there. I call it affective work, affective labor. In doing so, in preparing and working on this project, they were, in contact with so many people, artists, curators from Eastern Europe, and they performatively created something as a social background or social fundament of some sort of art history. So we should always have in mind this performative moment in working on these projects. uh, it took years, contacts, communications. They're sensibilizing the public for the program. The focus is on the story they were telling, and I quote from the book: "We went there, we met them, we organized discussion." Uh, and, uh, Actually, the whole NSK, Neue Slowenische Kunst project, started already at the beginning of the so-called process of fall of communism and the post-communist condition in '90, visiting visiting Moscow and starting discussion in Moscow with the artists and curators and intellectuals there, and opening the embassy of Neue Slowenische Kunst in Moscow. This happens at the beginning of the 90s, 1990 already. But as I'm saying, um, work on this project is not only about producing a book or producing some sort of visual presentation. The huge and important part is this performative part of the work on this project. And this is something that is different. They create some sort of social communication in the East beyond the Western canonization. It's something completely different, to go to New York, or to be invited to New York, or to be invited by MoMA to write something, then to to socialize on some sort of peer level in the East. But then, now, if you ask me where I first saw this picture, this East art map, this is interesting. I saw it in 2003. I think it was September in Galerie Essel, Kloster Neuburg, which is near Vienna. And it was an exhibition, Blood and Honey, curated, and the full title of the exhibition is Blood and Honey, the future is in the Balkans. And it was curated by legendary Harald Zeman, you know, the the curator who curated this famous Documenta 5, 100 Days of Documenta 5, and then who introduced this new type of exhibitions in German. It is called Grossausstellung, you know, big, huge exhibitions, great exhibitions in which artworks are put together around some central concept, general concept. And in this particular case, this was the concept of the Balkans. Uh, uh, the subtitle, as I said, was even more curious than the title, Blood and Honey. Blood and Honey is I don't know. They put it together, you know, to present this ambivalence of the Balkans. But you know, it's not about the future of the Balkans, but the future is in the Balkans. This was the subtitle, and uh, you know, Harald Zeman simply suggested. But I don't know. Today, of course, he died 2 years later after he curated this exhibition. But what he suggested, his message was clear. Look at the Balkans as a place that you can catch a glimpse of your future and even learn how to shape it. This was the idea. Uh, Today we can read it very dystopian way, you know, when we look at the European Union falling apart, when we look at the European Western nation states unable to create some sort of federation or confederation after Brexit. I know I don't have to talk much about it. You know what I mean. It's a failure. But then this is the collapse of former Yugoslavia, which was a federation. And this is also one crucial moment, that this federal state was not able to survive democracy, so-called democracy, and capitalism coming. And you know, the notion of Balkanization is used in political theory to describe these um, you know, small countries which have their own particular interests and cannot find any common language and common interests, etc. This very dystopian concept. But this is what is happening. What is happening now to Europe, which not, you know, the European Union itself. Uh, so interesting that some sort of announcement of a certain dystopian future was articulated in this exhibition. But what is more interesting, and why I'm talking about it, this was not the only one Balkan exhibition, or if you like, exhibition of Balkan art at that time. Few months before this exhibition, in Graz, also in Austria, um, there was Roger Conover, Eda Schufer, and Peter Weibel. They curated the exhibition Search of Balkania in 2002. And then comes few months later this Zeman's exhibition, the Blood and Honey, the future is in the Balkans. And again, within the same year, the third exhibition on the Balkans, in the gorges of the Balkans by René Bloch, a, again, a famous curator. It was in Kunsthalle Fridericianum in Kassel. So we had, within one single year, from like, the from September 2002 to September 2003, three huge exhibitions by famous curators on what is called the Balkan art. Please don't ask me what is the Balkan art. I don't know. And I don't know how this was possible, that suddenly the notion of the Balkan art pops up, and it lasts for 12 months and then disappears. This is what I'm, you know, the title of my presentation is Identitarian Cage. You see how identities, how they play with us. So this was the, of course, they were not three of them. I mean, more than three of them, but these three exhibitions were not coordinated. They were spontaneously developed. And it was funny situation that many artists, were presented in more than one exhibition of the Balkans. But what the label Balkan art, that was sort of invented through this exhibition, what this meant and why it disappeared shortly thereafter, this is quite enigmatic. I don't have this answer. And I'm mentioning this just to warn you when we speak about East European art, or, there were these concepts of Middle Europe. The concept became famous already at the beginning of the 80s, and it was more actually developed as a concept, as the idea of you put together a concept and an area, and you frame it in cultural, historical, political terms. Well, I would say the concept of the Middle Europe was invented uh, during the Cold War. And it was a sort of a critical approach, something that was neither East nor West, and it was invented not only in the West, in California. Just if you think of the books like the Wittgenstein's Vienna by Janik and Tulmin book, published 1980, it was published in California, but with the topic on Eastern, on Middle Europe, on Vienna, and also Johnson, the history. It was they looked into the Middle Europe and saw some sort of original cultural production. Just imagine like Vienna, fin de siècle, etc., etc. This concept of the Middle Europe disappeared after 1990. So it's quite arbitrary and it's quite contingent, and we might talk about Eastern Europe, East European art, etc. But we should never forget that tomorrow it could be forgotten immediately. But this tells something about the dynamics of art market, of art production, something we might discuss. The notion of the Balkans in this case, it's not something that relates truly to the Balkans, to the real Balkans. It just, it was some sort of a bubble that lasted for quite limited time, but it was a huge bubble. and you might think of how the galleries, depots in the West, they bought quite a lot of this art. So if you would like you know, as a writer of an art history of the Balkans, if you would like to do it, then you would go to Vienna, to the galleries, because they have the collections. They bought it. Um, Generali, the Erste, etc., etc. So it is about in you know, you don't have to go to the Balkans to write the history of Balkan art. You can do it in Vienna. This is again something we should keep in mind. So I don't know whether this will be also the case with the East European art, but I'm leaving this question to you. But let us come back to the notion of the East, or the Eastern Europe. East, in this our particular case, in our discourse, is clearly a Cold War concept. What is interesting is that the concept has survived the Cold War divide and the collapse of communism, or as you properly would say, socialism. And the question is, how comes that it has survived? Because you know, uh, um, the, for me, the answer to this question would open uh, and can open and should open really a clear insight into what we might call post-communist condition, or as I have to correct myself after your title, post-socialist condition, which is much better. Um, and if there is any divide between West and East worth debating today in these terms, then this is the one which takes place within the very notion of post-socialism or post-communism. This does not mean only that both West and East are in similar way post-communist. We might, of course, think of the Western capitalism being also post-communist in terms that it was precisely the fall of the Eastern European socialist systems that makes globalization possible. So um, um, the spread of neoliberal global capitalism to the whole world, and this is what actually happens: the integration of the former East into the global neoliberal capitalism. Uh, but So in these terms, the notion of post-communism or post-socialism applies also to the global condition. This is not only a condition of the former, as it is, you know, it's a former East, former socialist countries in the Eastern Europe. But let me remind you of how the notion of the West and the East was used during the Cold War, and we understand it retrospectively today. Um, of course, the story is told from the victorious Western angle, uh, which means in today's hegemonic discourse, which identifies the West with democracy, freedom, prosperity, justice, rule of law, human rights, uh, whereas the identity of the East can be uh, summed up under the notion, the best, of totalitarianism, the experience of oppression, terror, gulag, of cultural, economic backwardness in all aspects of human life, social, private, economic, cultural, etc. To put it very simple, the West is good, the East is bad. And the West has won the Cold War, and the East has lost the Cold War. However, it has survived. but it has survived in terms of cultural difference. So there is no Eastern Bloc. The Soviet military pact, the Eastern military bloc does not exist. Um, the Soviet army is not here a few hundred meters away from where I'm now sitting in East Berlin, but the cultural difference has survived the, the collapse. The problem, of course, with this story is that it tells us the history of socialism as a global phenomenon through an exclusively bipolar logic. What we see is only the West and the East. You know, if you ask me what is the West, I don't know. We might discuss what everybody uses it. You know, you just you read the news, and then you might read phrases like the West must decide, the West is retreating from Afghanistan, the West should find an answer to Putin, the West, the West has will bomb Tripoli, or the West will bomb, you know, the West will occupy Iraq. The West always is, there is some sort of subject. But if you ask then, uh, is it democracy? What the West does? Is there any democratic body and institution that makes these decisions? No, of course not. So we have to deal with with a concept which is definitely a normative identity block, the West. And it is not clear. It has nothing to do with geography, with geographical areas. As you know, just to remind you, Antonio Gramsci in his prison notebooks once wrote that every place on earth, every place on earth is in the same way, east and west and north and south. There is no such thing as a clear geographical location of these concepts. They are ideological, they are cultural, they are normative, and they create these hierarchies. As I said, at the end of the Cold War, everything is clear. The West is good and victorious, the East is bad. But the problem is that there is no only West and East in the world. And there is clearly this idea, the West and the East, clearly and openly excludes what was at that time, what is today called South, at that time the third world. The first world, you know, was but you have, of course, the hierarchy. The West, the second world was the socialist East, and the third world was at that time during the 20s the world of former colonialism, the world of anti-colonial struggles, 70s, you have it, you know, Vietnam War, etc., etc. Um, but the problem is that there is a missing third term, missing third concept in our discussion of the East, which should you know, we should think of it, we should be aware of it. So the problem is, of course, I will come later to this, but the problem is that uh, generally speaking, we use the notion of East today to cover the notion of former socialism. However, there is no possibility to unify a specific historical um, uh, um, notion of socialism. There is not a single common experience. And I will tell you simply one anecdote which uh, uh, 20 years after the fall of communism in Salzburg, there was a conference on, 20 years democracy, post-socialism, etc. And there was a young scholar. She was originally from Bosnia, but she got her PhD at Harvard, and in this sort of area studies, Southeastern Europe studies, etc. And she was dealing with the film history of former Yugoslavia. This was the topic of her PhD, and she gave a speech which was, this classical simplified story about poor artists who have no freedom to express themselves, exposed to censorship, etc. At the same time, a huge production, film production, and important, etc. And then I asked her. She was talking specifically about one film in the 60s, and I wrote a book about this film and its author, and I asked a very simple question, whether she knows who financed the film. And she couldn't believe that she got this question, because she believed that everybody knows who financed culture in socialism. And then everybody looked at me. What a strange question. And they said, of course, the state. It was completely wrong. The state was not financing culture in terms of, but in concrete case, this film was made by a bank loan in the 60s in former Yugoslavia. So you have, it is a market socialism. 95% of artists in former Yugoslavia and those who made film were freelancers, contractors. They worked for me too. Mid 80s, I am also a free artist, so-called free artist on the market, and I have to survive from contract to contract. This is one thing. And then you have a concept of socialism in former Yugoslavia in which there is almost no state property. Not a factory, not a hotel was a state owned. And not even that, the education was not financed by the state budget, but by a group of economic producers who would have interest in special knowledge, like tourism industry had interest in foreign languages, of course not in Russian at that time, but English, German, Italian, etc. Russian is now important, but not during the socialism. I'm giving you an idea about complexity of this experience. When you say socialism, what you actually mean? And the Western concept, when in the West, when it is used, the East and the socialism, it always implies some sort of totally dehistoricized and simplified notion in which the concept of socialism is defined by few features like, I don't know, one-party system, no market, closed community, um, military bloc, etc., etc., etc. This is a very problematic idea. Nela mentioned the non-aligned movement in former Yugoslavia. It's a 70 years, 61. It was the first conference, non-aligned conference in Belgrade, with Tito from Yugoslavia, Gamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt, and Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister of India, independent India. They created some sort of counter project to the Cold War, but it was also part of socialism. They called it Third World's Yalta, and that the socialism implies also the critique of both colonialism, and socialism also implies the critique of the Cold War divide. And I'm mentioning it is 71. In Belgrade, you have the meeting of this third world of people, of the political representatives. At the same time, it was in September. In October, in Paris, you have Paris massacre. Probably you have heard about it. Hundreds of Algerians were killed on the streets of Paris while demonstrating against the colonial oppression of France. This is still the war in Algeria ongoing when this happens. I'm just like giving you an idea of the complexity of the historical reality behind or beyond these concepts. Not only complexity, but ambiguity and contradictions. So, you know, the West is democratic, the East is not, etc. Human rights. This is much more complicated. So, and you know, speaking from Berlin, probably you know they reconstructed here in the center of Berlin a former palace, and which consists in part of ethnological exhibition. And you know, the center of Berlin is full of what we call today looted art, the so-called Museum Island. You have Egyptian, African, you have everything looted here. If you go to the Museum of Yugoslavia in Belgrade, you will find also a museum full of exhibits and objects from the South, from the global South. However, there are only donations. Nothing is looted. It's only given, you know, as a gifts. This think in terms of future. What should be the future? You know, should we think in terms of this Western Berlin way of collecting art and writing art history, or what has been you know, what happened during socialism in former Yugoslavia when it comes to the anti-colonial, post-colonial history. But this was also quite an epistemological story, because during this, let's say, I can because I studied the what we call today epistemologies of the South, the knowledges of the South in translation were present there in the education in former Yugoslavia. This has been completely erased. The legacy of its openness toward the South, it's the legacy in the anti-colonial struggle, the legacy in the fight for the world peace against Cold War divide. It has been completely erased. The turn from socialism to the so-called democracy implies implies Eurocentrism. It implies total Westernization and erasure of any other historical legacy and experiences. So this is also the problem that should be addressed. This is not, you know, I might if you would look at the film production in Eastern Europe, how East European film makers were communicating and working together, this would give you also quite a different history. But let me see how this then develops 1989, 1990. And the question is, what happened? What happened at that moment? The answer was given already 89 by German philosopher Jürgen Habermas in his text and also the book Die nachholende Revolution, which is the catching up revolution or rewinding revolution, rückspülende Revolution. And well, his idea in the book is that the Eastern European societies, by removing communist rulers, made possible for themselves to catch up with the missed historical, cultural, and economic development of the West. So the idea of the post-socialism or post-communism as a historical condition was defined precisely in terms of a surviving divide between West and the East, in which the East was defined as a belated, in need to catch up with the missed development. There was this sort of, cultural difference that was at the same time also temporal difference. So this was not, the East and the West are not on the same level. This is how anthropology also works, because the other for the classical anthropology is not simply, situated in another place, but always already in another time. So the West and the East are defined precisely, but not sharing one and the same time and not sharing one and the same temporality. So you see how cultural difference implies temporal difference. And I very often I quote Rolf Dahrendorf, who is a German liberal political theorist. Already in the 60s, he opposed this 68 Bewegung movement as a liberal, and he became then later Lord in Britain. And in his book Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, commenting, also 1990 published, and he precisely defined the temporal difference between the West and the East. And I will quote you so that you get some idea how concretely this was articulated. So he writes, to join the club of the developed Western democracies, the post-communist societies need, first, 6 months for establishing the constitutional and political framework. He calls it the hour of the lawyer, laying down the basic values of statehood, fundamental rights, the main paradigms of the rule of law, independent administration of justice, separation of power, etc., etc. Then they need 6 years for constructing the rudiments of a true market economy, juridical guarantees for anti-monopolism, economic rivalry, free competition, etc., etc. He calls it the hour of economists. 6 months for political changes, judicial, institutional, 6 years for economic transformation, and for the final implementation of a free democratic society relying on the power of its well-developed civil society. He calls it the hour of citizen. No less than 60 years, which means that Eastern, according to this timeline, today's East European societies are, halfway to the full democracy. However, if you look at what is happening today, with this populist, so-called populist, conservative new leaders, authoritarian, not only in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, on the like Russia or Belarus, but also within European Union. Look at this conservative regime in Poland now, or Viktor Orban's regime, ethno-nationalist regime in Hungary, not to mention the Yugoslav wars of the 90s and unsolved problems of Bosnia, etc., etc. But just, we think that there are certain values, liberal values, that are exclusively Western, like, for instance, the right to abortion, for instance, or something we might call the liberation of women, the legacy of feminist movement, like, right to women, of a woman right to divorce, for instance, and decriminalization of homosexuality. Just to remind you, the first country in the world that legalized abortion, gave right to women to divorce, simply according to the wish of woman, and decriminalized homosexuality was Bolshevik Russia, 1917. And uh, just, you know, was it West? Was it East? Was it communist totalitarianism or something else? Well, I'm just leaving this question to you. However, reminding you that there is always history of everything, also the history of communism. 1933, the Tsarist so-called sodomy laws against homosexuals were reintroduced in the Soviet Union. Even Maxim Gorky wrote about homosexuals as fascists. And then later, 38, abortion was prohibited again. So you see how these developments were, how they are contradictory and contingent. At the end of the 20s in Moscow, the institutions, one citizen wanted to change gender, and they even, created a commission to consider his will, whether they can do it, on a medical, psychological, and other other way at that time. So this is something something we should keep in mind. What the point is, and I'm repeating it again, it's a historical contingency. What is today, what looks today as a once forever reached level of development can be erased tomorrow and vanish overnight. But this is nothing new in the so we still believe that, and we use the notion of Western values and think that all positive values are some sort. It's possible to define it in terms of being essential features of this identitarian normative identity block called West. I will just like speed up just to remind you what is this East. And now I will rely, and I mentioned already this temporal difference, but the East in itself today as a concept implies something as we might call ahistoricity or dehistoricization. And let me quote a good friend of mine, Slovenian philosopher Rastko Močnik, writing about Eastern. So as I said, the East has survived the Cold War divide. Eastern means still Eastern. That is that Eastern modernity is belated. Eastern is defined as belated in relation to the West, which in relation to the West makes it particular, specific, and localized, while the West is universal, of course. It's non-specific. It's not local. However, on the other side, Western modernity is not only uh, uh, always already in its proper place, it is also always on time. In other words, and I quote Rastko Močnik, the West is timeless, it's canonic, it is general, it is a non-space, since it is a norm, a measure against which the peripheral, the provincial, is to be measured. So it's not, the West and the East have no common history because, or better, I just like quote, according to Močnik, the East-West divide is an ideological phenomenon. Its ideological function is to rob both sides of their history. The West appears as emancipated from its own history, in fact, from any history, which is why it can be imposed as general canonic. It is the measure of history, it's not history. For Močnik, the West takes on the form of a real existing utopia, Contrary to this, the notion of the East functions as a form of amnesia, for its telos, that is the goal to be reached in the future, is to get rid of history, to become an ahistorical non-space like the West. Its own history is what makes the East peripheral, provincial, what in short makes it the East. Because the history is the history of belatedness, you know. Uh, as Mochik writes, the East has a history that would be better forgotten. So it is not easy to write the history of the East because this history is, according to today's hegemonic ideological condition, this history is of no value whatsoever. The result is that within the West-East divide, the East robs both sides of their common history and prevents them both from having a common history in the future. I quote Moshnik again. It freezes them into an eternal unequal couple, one part of which is forever doomed to struggle to get rid of its phantom past, while the other is bound to an everlasting autistic celebration of its idiocy. The East is thus doomed to struggle for recognition, which is the East Art map. And the form of this struggle is called identity. Mochnik again. An identity is the ambiguous privilege of those doomed to remain local, particular, peripheral. It is a euphemism for the incapacity to attain the serene firmament of universality. So there is, there is no way to catch up with the West. So the dehistoricization is inherent in the notion of the East. It ascribes the fall of communism to certain immanent features of the really existing socialism. You know, socialism has collapsed because it did not have a market economy. The state was too strong. It didn't have parliamentary democracy, etc., etc. But what is erased from this picture are political and social struggles within historical socialism themselves. The history of socialism is the history of struggles in which, as I said, the, the during the 20s, the homosexuals in the best place for homosexuals in the world was in the Bolshevik Russia. It has changed, however. So this ideology tells us that the Berlin Wall fell and wants us to forget that it was torn down in the popular struggle for freedom and better life. And to quote Moshe again, the notion of the East performs a historical amnesia. It erases the political dimension from the Eastern past and achieves likewise effects in the present. So the notion of the East is the concept that depoliticizes historical consciousness and historical experience. And this is closely connection to the culturalization on everything. In closing my talk, just to remind you of as you know, the Frederick Jameson book on postmodernity has the subtitle of the cultural logic of the late capitalism, of culturalization. And Jameson writes about the culturalization of everything in a postmodernity and writes, everything, including commodity production and high and speculative finance, has become cultural, and culture has equally become profoundly economic and commodity oriented. And identities are the past, are the essential part, a part of a culturalized picture of the world. Let me close it with the notion of closure. Closure. I wrote more than 10 years ago a book on a post-socialism, post-communism in German. Another is in English, but this was in German. The zone of transition, the Zone des Übergangs. But the subtitle of my book is On the End of Post-Communism. So not the end of communism, but the end of post-communism. I will put it very simple, and this is how I will close this talk. The so-called post-socialist condition has come to its end. And what actually has collapsed is the very teleology of this condition. This idea of the catching up with the West, of the East catching up with the East. The epochal process of the so-called post-communist transition to democracy that was initiated immediately after the collapse of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe has failed. In fact, what I already said, it's very teleology based on a quasi self-evident belief that Western type liberal democracy in harmony with neoliberal global capitalism is the only option in our historical horizon. This teleology has broken, and we did the entire historical condition. We no longer live after the collapse of communism, but rather after the collapse of post-communism or post-socialism, as you would properly say. So, and this is generally, these are few ideas I would like to discuss with you that pretend to draft some sort of conceptual field in which we might discuss something like Eastern art, East art history, etc. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Boris. This was absolutely fascinating, as we expected, I must say. I have drafted about 5 questions for you, which will take us till the end of our event. So I'm not going to start in case somebody else has a question for you. I forgot to introduce you properly. You have done it yourself really well, but I'll come back to that because you've done so many things in your life, and I think it gets reflected in the way you speak. It was very academic, but also journalistic, accessible and approachable for all the people who are here and are not necessarily very much informed about the subject as we have been discussing in this platform, but also for us who have been dealing with this for some time, it has been absolutely wonderful. So thank you for all the layers that you have brought in this conversation, and I'm going to open it firstly to the audience if there are any burning questions. If not, I'll start. So I'm inviting people who are with us today: Arjun, Dave, Elizabeth, Elisaveta, Elsbieta, Felipe, Garipalia, Jennifer, Julia, Ann, Kate, Marcia, Noemi, Renjun, Tina, and Veronica. Any questions? Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yes, Elizabeth.
Hello there. Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question which is about how to resolve the tension between being historically extremely specific and attending to all of those very specific social, political, economic conditions that you mentioned, as you know, in relation to Yugoslavia, whilst at the same time avoiding the kind of identitarian trap of creating and, you know, as in East Art Map, an anthology of, you know, different perspectives that ultimately maybe is also problematic. And I feel like there's a tension and contradiction between those two things, and I wonder how it's possible to resolve that tension, if you have any ideas.
You know, if you ask me, I would say that the concept of identity is genuinely, I might say, anti-historian. You know, not simply ahistorical or dehistorical, but anti-historical. It, you know, this, it perfectly fits to the condition which understands itself in terms of post-history. You know, it's not only Fukuyama. This is quite a long story of the concept of post-history, which is you know, the Alexandre Kojev, Russian emigrant in Paris in the 30s, who gave lectures on Hegel. He was the first to coin the concept of post history, and he meant simply that post history is the time in which the nation states disappear, and the new complex um, political institutions, transnational institutions, are created. So Kojev, when you know, the start of the European Union, already in the 40s, when it started, he dropped philosophy. He ceased to write, and he became the clerk of the European Union, believing that the European Union and, on the other side, Soviet Union are the future of the world. He even 48 wrote letters to Stalin, you know, in terms of, oh, you are building now Soviet Union and we are here building European Union. There will be a common history. We will come together. This is on the other side, post-histoire was introduced already in the 40s by the disappointed Nazi theorists and intellectuals who believed that with the fall of Adolf Hitler and great Germany, of this, you know, the whole project of the 1,000 years Reich, the history makes no sense. That history is closed. That Adolf Hitler was the last word of the history. So, and Fukuyama is not original, but he took it and created the concept, famous concept of post history, meaning post history is not that nothing happens in the world, uh, but this is a condition in which no political option will be able to challenge the concept of Western liberal democracy. So he conceived of post history as being a total westernization of the world, which is, as I said, the notion of the West is ahistorical. So you see, this is, and then if you ask me how to articulate what is historically specific, this is major question. Uh, how to um, how to rehistoricize our experience, how to come out from this never-ending struggle for recognition of identities, you know, different, not only national, you know, this gender, race, everything. Uh, how to come out and revive something that is historical experience, because this historical experience, I mentioned the case of the Bolshevik Russia, which was at that time, you know, after the revolution, this was for the whole Western liberal world, the realization of this dream, of their dreams. And you know, it's also sexual policy, Alexandra Kollontai, you know, it's so much. Not to speak about art, about avant-garde. Uh, but look, today seems that East means former socialism, and that former socialism is a sort of cultural identity, something that is belated, and that the people in the East, they need, I don't know how many 100 years to learn what is intra-racial, intra-gender tolerance, you know, how to treat tolerantly different sexual identities, etc., etc. But you have, you know, this relation between the educator and a pupil, you know, who has to learn. Why it has to learn? Because it has forgotten. It has forgotten the knowledge, the experience, the legacies of the possibility of radical transformation. And it was the radical transformation. We might discuss why, you know, speaking from the perspective of former Yugoslavia, also having a very concrete experience, not intellectual. When I was in the army as a soldier in the former Yugoslav army, I was trained to fight the Eastern Bloc, you know. So Red Army, Hungarian, I don't know, which is completely different experience, but this was part of the training. But this was not the reason for me to think, oh, this is not socialism, or this is not a proper socialism. And speaking of socialism, we should also consider anti-colonial stories of socialism, you know, how they developed. So, Frederick Jameson early book on political unconsciousness, uh, it begins with a very simple, short sentence: always historicize. You know, with a claimer, always historicize. This is something I can always I can repeat. However, it is almost impossible. But I don't have, you know, uh, how to articulate what is historically specific. First, how to articulate what is historical. But you know, since Fukuyama a few years ago admitted that the concept of post-history has failed, but everything, oh, history is back on stage, etc. It's not that history is back on stage. What is back is contingency. It's what I said, that we don't know. You know, the condition of post-socialism was sort of a blessed conditions. In terms, everything was clear for the societies after the fall of communism. The path was clear. The only one possibility without alternatives on the horizon, which is this Western democracy, etc., etc. But this experience of simplicity, you know, beyond any historical political complexities, this is what has gone, and it cannot be revived. We live in a world in which, again, unfortunately, maybe everything is possible. So it is possible, and then, you know, we saw it in the United States. We saw the sort of, they would call it totalitarianism today. I never use this concept because it does not help us to understand anything. But look, this is you know, the so-called post-secularism is not something that is a feature of the belated East, somewhere not properly westernized, democratized. It comes from the very heart of the United States. You know, this fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, etc. It's not outside; it is within. I'm simply reminding you that, for good or bad, the history is back, which means the contingency is back. And not only that, what is back and what we should deal with is a new old need. And we know it, you know, in these days. It is said, if we don't radically change this development, the sun will burn us soon. There will be, you know, the point of no return. Speaking of years, not of centuries, of years. This means that the notion of radical change, which was called revolution earlier, is back. We should be able again to think in terms of radical change, maybe including violence, I don't know, but radical change, because there is no other option. This is what is back, and radical change is the possibility to transform something. As I've said, you know, you have in Tsarist Russia sodomist law, but 1 year later, homosexuals are free. Petersburg, St. Petersburg was full of gay bars at that time. You know, I'm talking about a situation 100 years ago. Which, what is this Russian identity? Is this socialist identity? Is this Western identity? I don't know, but there is the need to think also in terms of radical change, and this is what, you know, what what makes history moving. Then this is what history is back. Not only that we don't know what happens, but also that we might change something radically.
Thank you, Elisabetta. Thank you, Boris, as well. I'm thinking in terms of practice, how Elisabetta's question is, in a way, how to avoid essentialism in the work that we are doing. And in practice, you mentioned that Art Market achieved the integration of the East into global capital. I've been a couple of weeks ago on Belgrade Art Weekend, curated by Anne Penhusen from Berlin. And I mean, I always think that these kind of replica of, or the interpretations of structures of arts events that exist in the West, in the East somehow look much sadder. The, the reason is not in the richness of the resources. The reason is in the kind of conceptual framework that doesn't really fit, because it's not that it's not original, it's just not coming from the locale. And that is the richness that the locale is losing by not exploring its own kind of sources. But on the other hand, if you don't go that way, what you get is a lot of a declarative art that I have seen in the work of East European artists in the East. This struggle with identity that somehow gets a really kind of represented in some kind of messages. So the artwork is always a message of a sort. So either you have this kind of bastardized Western version, or you have the Eastern version that is such a struggle with the identity that kind of doesn't necessarily reflect the art, but it's some kind of information, like a journalistic piece or something. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you see the practice reflecting the philosophy that you have just described, that is a struggle between essentialisms?
Uh, you know, when you mention the notion of practice, then I'm reminded of the fact that I studied philosophy in Zagreb with the so-called Praxis philosophers. And that was the philosophy of Praxis, which was precisely sort of thinking in which it was also very critical of what we might think of as, you know, academic knowledge production, where the institutions called universities produce knowledge, but at the same time this knowledge is very often of no use except within the academia for for making careers. So as Wolfgang Streeck, German sociologist, would say, the left progressive thinking rules the space above the seminar tables. You know, this is, but not in the society, in the reality of life. Praxis philosophy was precisely sort of critique of this. You know, we just think of these thinkers, like I mentioned, Gramsci. Of course, he didn't make any academic career. You know, guys, about Walter Benjamin. He was not able to enter German academia, and then you can think of the 30s in Germany. Thousands of philosophy professors were there, you know, and we know nothing about them. They were producing some knowledge in the Nazi regime, and this simply disappeared. All these books, all just, you know, translated into how many hours of philosophy teaching in the 30s in Germany. But there was Walter Benjamin, we discuss we discussed now, who was excluded, who did not got a chance to enter the academia. So this is one thing. And another thing is something I have been dealing last year with, the notion of re-vernacularization. Okay, don't break your tongues. But you know, vernaculars are languages before they were standardized. You know, in created into um, improved into what we now call standardized national languages, you know, German, Italian, etc., etc. What is happening now in Europe, in the whole Europe, and this is the fact, this is the reality. I mean, you know, we don't think so much using English in discussing and knowledge production. Speaking of art history of Eastern Europe, either it will be written in English or it won't be. And it will not exist. Let's say it openly. What is with what happens to what is still produced in these languages? This is a German theorist of languages, specialist of Humboldt language philosophy, Jürgen Trabant. Um, he he wrote a book on and it was much discussed on a German language becoming in Germany a vernacular. In Germany, where, you know, 90% of my teaching in Germany and Austria is in English. But not only that, that the all high discourses in economy, politics, knowledge, and science take place in English, while German language, and I am talking about the most powerful country of the European Union, about the language with 100 million rich speakers, and this is becoming a vernacular again. Think of our little languages, my Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian, Slovenian. You know, this is they even the last there was a research on how European languages deal with the digital condition, and on the European Union did the research, and they analyzed 30 European languages. For 22 of them, they uh, they say that they won't survive in digital age. They are going to die out. So I'm, you know, speaking of how to practically revive a local, you know, knowledge of local histories. What you mentioned, local specific. You know, the language is disappearing to do it. Uh, I might, you know, talk about it for quite a long. Let me put it this way: the way back to the praxis, the way back to the practical implementation of these ideas, including the ideas of justice, you know, and non-hierarchical thinking of social and cultural relations in today's world, it must revive this also these spaces which I call vernacular spaces, you know, these local spaces. We must start to be able to think in these so-called vernacular languages, and I'm not meaning only, you know, national languages. I mean a language also in terms of discourses, in terms of specific cultural experiences. So the idea that there will be some universal knowledge, universal history, universal concept of art, universal art history, like MoMA is writing, collecting, with all the tolerance towards the other, etc. This is not the case. We must introduce something that the practices of translation, in which completely different space of thinking, of cultural and art producing, and even labor and social articulation. Um, it's I'm just like, it's a different space, but this is not simple. It's not a simple answer to your question, but your question is both essential and difficult to answer. But the way we have been doing it is wrong, to put it. This is wrong. We have to change it also radically, also in our thinking. The idea of philosophers of praxis was that the true thinking is possible only in the praxis of transformation, social transformation, which means changing. Only if your thinking is a part of real practical transformation, then it is worth to be called knowledge. Otherwise, it's something else.
Thank you, Boris. I would like to bring Ewelina in on the question of language. But firstly, let's, because two of us are hosting the talk, if somebody else wants to speak, but Ewelina, I think this was your cue.
No, I actually have a question which is vaguely related to actually speech, which you talked about historicizing things. Do you mean creating narratives and owning these narratives?
It's a good question.
What do you mean?
Look, this is a question which we should answer, not only as academics, being aware of the discourses about, yes, narratives, telling stories, who tells stories, how the story is told, is it a testimony or scientific or something. We have experience with art. My point is that the past does not exist. We should produce it. But what produces the past? It does not suffice to say narratives, different narratives, this or that storytellings, discourses. Past is produced in what I would call curatorial practice. Past is produced not only in academic books or novels or TV serials. The past is produced as a graffitis on the walls. Past is produced in a different media, in a social media. Just imagine of how so-called social media participate in the common production of the past, which was not the case 30, 40 years ago. So history, how it is said in English, jumping the gun. We jump the gun when we say history is narrated. Under this transformed media landscape, this is not possible to say. It's not simply telling the story. It is practicing something, as I said, curating is a practice that much better explains what once was called history writing or narrating, because you have to combine, something performative. You have to combine social action, activism, articulate so-called memory cultures, both institutional and in so-called grassroots practices. So this is what is history, but a simple way, a return back to, what is the truth of the past? Let's ask a historian. This is over. This is already 88 in the States. They publish, that there was a clear idea that a common history is no longer possible, because there was a left history, right history, feminist history, history of African Americans. It fell apart in many, many, many histories without any possibility to sum it up under one narrative. And as I'm saying, it's not only narrative. This is why art and experience of curating and experiences of this transformation in the curatorial practice. I mentioned Harald Zeman, introducing discourses into into exhibitions and concepts, etc. It is not about art um, um, writing history. It is about art dealing and working with concepts, not being able to articulate itself without concepts, without narratives. But just like to put it very, very simple, let's try to think of what once was history writing in terms of curating the past, which means a production,
That was lovely. Thank you. I must tell you, Boris, I co-chair a working group, Arts and Memory for Memory Studies Association. And at the moment, we are at the kind of crossroads. We are trying to get rid of the old editorial board, executive committee, all the people who are kind of set up the organizations. They are historians. They're really not reflecting what's going on at the moment in memory studies field that is totally mediated. Thanks to not necessarily social media, but all other things. I mean, everybody's dealing with memory nowadays. We are all kind of trying to reach the truth of our own identities and the world in the past as well as in the future. So thank you for this. But you mentioned curating history. When I was doing my PhD 10 years ago, I was really grateful for the former East, for the former West, for the website. I saw that platform as being something that was created in a way that I can kind of digest and feel supported by. Does it still exist? You were really maybe even a founder or one of the founding members of
No,
West,
I was not the founding. It's Maria Hlavajova who is behind it, and there is an institution back. But I was always there, so to say, contributing and working with, and then also curating. At the HKW in Berlin, I curated a huge event, discursive event, as a part of a former West exhibition. So yes, however, just the problem with the former West is that it is again a sort of counter practice. It to give you a very simple answer, it has yet to be really articulated. What is this? Maria Hlavajova uses this notion of formering the West, making it former, but it is not that easy, because we think of the West and the East as being some sort of units, having some sort of space, etc. It is all about bordering. It is not about spaces. Forget the spaces. Think of bordering as a space of articulation, as a space of identity production, as border is a space and a practice. It's a violent practice sometimes, but it's discursive practice. But it is a practice, bordering. And this is what defines concepts like the West and the East. Their use in bordering. And bordering is a practice necessary for the global neoliberal capitalism to go on, to reproduce itself. So it's not that easy, just to say, oh, the West is an expression of cultural and historical injustice. It is definitely, but you cannot simply jump out of it, because you cannot simply jump out of bordering of the practice. You don't have to be the subject of it. You might be the victim, but it is there. And we see how it functions. We see only, we see the migrants, and we see how the problem of migration has become the central problem of the so-called Western democracies. You know, like the question whether it will survive or fail, and how it mobilizes political forces. But this is closely connected to the notions of the West and the East, as you know. So we should like more think in terms of, when we use these notions in terms of, you know, borders, bordering, the social role, but also epistemological. You know, the West is a site of knowledge, and the South and the East is the places where there is a lack of knowledge. They have to learn to catch up, etc., etc. As you know, the Sousa Santos epistemologists of the South, you know, they turned this. Yes, it was the West, the Western colonialism, that destroyed and erased the knowledges of the South, which in a much, for us today, better way express the so-called relation between the humans and nature, have completely different concept of nature, which we need now, but we don't have it. We have erased it in our Western, rational, modern knowledge, scientific modern production. So anytime the notion of the West or East or South is mentioned, think of borders, of bordering as a practice and its political ideological use.
I have a question, Boris, about when going back to the curating the past. How do you avoid the trappings of nostalgia?
You think it's a trap? Nostalgia is a trap. Um, um, you know, first, those who deal with nostalgia would immediately, who seriously, critically deal with nostalgia, would immediately say, this is not, you know, a dream about some better past. This is always an expression of a critique of the existing situation. This is how you read nostalgia. This is not simply a belief that a life was better before, but it's much more that a life as it is cannot stay as it is, that it should be changed. So nostalgia might have you know, the strength of mobilization, and it is a site of critical thinking, critical cultural articulation, definitely. But, however, it depends what it means. Um, uh, so it is not simply a trap, but for me is much bigger problem something that is called culture of memory, which is an improved version of nostalgia. It is like a reflexive nostalgia. Uh, as you know, speaking from Germany claims to be this the place where what they call it Erinnerungskultur, the the culture of memory is mostly developed, and it produces the best effects. You know, if someone can properly remember, Germans can. If someone can create a proper museum of memory, you know, memory site, to to mention Pierre Nora, well, the Germans can do it. They have the, you know, this is a huge expectation and investment in a memory culture that might be very, very, very dangerous. I always I'm involved in a building of a memory center of a former Stasi, former German Democratic Republic secret police in Leipzig, and I have the problem of these Germans who believe that in properly articulating, culturally articulating such a memory, we will be able to prevent, return of totalitarianism, of fascism, of secret police, etc., etc. I always say, but look, it's not about the possibility of return. It has already returned, the surveillance and everything. But the problem of the memory, it overestimates the, the importance of consciousness and education, and does forget that the consciousness can be changed overnight, and then that what people learn, they can immediately forget. This is a very, very, a broad answer and simplified answer to your questions. But I would say that the time of nostalgia is over. We can remember nostalgia. There was a books, or the future of nostalgia. This, but that nostalgia has been replaced by the various forms of memory culture, of memory that has replaced history. What used to be history is today called memory, with Pierre Nora, etc., with social memory, collective memory, cultural memory, etc. So memory studies, as you know, this is uh, very much part of the practice of artistic production. My master students in Weimar, I would say that like 60 to 80% of them deal with the past and deal with different forms of memory articulation. They are totally focused on it, which is of course interesting and had emancipatory effects, hopefully. Um, but this obsession is in itself very, very problematic. Obsession with the past, obsession with the memory, as though we believe that the memory will save us. I'm not sure.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? We have a time for one more.
I think that's okay, Ewelina, because we need to kind of close the whole set of master classes, and maybe you want to say something about the project as well. If there are no questions, I think it's okay, no?
Yeah.
We were with Boris for 2 hours. That's
wonderful.
a lot.
Thank you so
You guys
much.
as you see, I have survived. Well, everything is okay. And it was a pleasure for me. And I think these topics are very, very important. And then you should continue critically dealing with it. And especially, the using the notion, which is rare, of post-socialism. It's in fact shown a step forward, critical step forward, because it, this would be a topic for another talk. But as we who have some experiences with the former socialism, we know this socialism never called itself communism. This it was socialism. Communism was something else. And this notion is much better, should be used. So instead of post-communism, we shall use post-socialism. Finally, post-communism was invented by the anti-communist of the Cold War, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who even did not um, foresee the fall of communism, so of socialism. So thank you very much for inviting me, for giving a chance to share with you some of my thoughts that need to be developed, and some critical points that still need to be better articulated. But this was an opportunity for me to do it a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And with the project, please watch this space. We have one more workshop coming up when we'll be going through all the ideas that were disseminated during those masterclasses. And this will come in a couple of months' time, date to be confirmed soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And Boris's latest book, published by Archive Books, is in our library. So it's called Transition to Nowhere. I just put the link in the chat. So if anyone wants to read Boris's essays on various things, you can get the book from our library. Thank you, Boris.
Okay. Thank you, guys, and have a nice day today. Bye-bye from Berlin.
You too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you for the audience as well. Bye.